Welcome to Windy Night Stories. Tonight's story is by Joan Aiken, The Shrieking Door. After Father got killed in an industrial accident, we moved away to live in a wood. Mother didn't want any reminders. We could understand why she did this, in a way, but it was lonely for Alice and me. Luckily we had each other. Ma got paid some compensation for his death. As if anything could compensate, she said, and we agreed. Anyway, it wasn't very much, but enough to buy the cottage in the wood, Mulkey Copse, part of the New Forest, where Ma was able to support us more or less by doing scientific translations from German and reading manuscripts for publishers, also by renting out rooms. We turned the upstairs part of the cottage into a self-contained flat and advertised in the Lady. All summer long there would be people in the flat, coming and going. Mostly they were the quiet kind, people for whom the ad that said, secluded self-contained flat in the forest, offered just what they wanted. Professors, painters, and people who wanted to be alone. Botanists, musicians, sad people, people who had been ill. Mostly they'd be out all day, riding or driving or walking in the forest. Ma would cook them an evening meal if they wanted, but generally they preferred to take care of themselves. This arrangement suited Ma very well. She likes solitude. She doesn't want company. If I lived in the Middle Ages, I'd probably have been called a witch, she says. So the odd good morning with the lodgers as they passed in and out gave her all she needed. Alice and I biked to Brockford Halt every day, took the train to Portsbourne, and went to the high school. It was okay. Alice is better at math and music. I'm better at science and art. Neither of us is any use at English. We've no imagination, Mr. Hicks says. We made a few friends and did the shopping for Ma in Portsbourne after school, and slowly became accustomed to the pain of Father's loss. At first people took us for twins, as we're very alike. In fact, there is 1 year between us. But Alice, though the older, is more timid than I am. With people, that is. In the forest she is much more confident, being very keen and knowledgeable about wildflowers. She'll go anywhere, miles and miles, to look for a green man orchid or a broom rape, whereas, though I love trees individually, I can really have a relationship with a tree. I badly miss the old willow tree in the garden of our other house. Well, as I say, I can love a tree for itself, but I find a whole mass of them together rather scary. If I'm alone in a wood and a twig snaps, I'm liable to run a mile. Still, as Alice said, I'd better get over that, for there we were in the middle of a whole forest. Our cottage, Maloke College, was very old. Parts of it went back to the Tudor days. The floor was brick, the front door made from one massive oak slab, gray with age. Although it had tiny windows, the house wasn't dark, since it stood in a clearing, quite a big one, where Mother, who always enjoys gardening, in a rough and ready way, was able to grow vegetables for us and the lodgers, as well as nasturtiums and marigolds. No use trying to grow roses. The deer ate them all. Mr. Hicks told Alice that you can keep away deer if you buy human hair from a barber and tie hanks of it about the garden. We tried doing that, but the deer in our part of the woods seemed immune to the human hair trick. They went right on coming and ate just as much as ever. At night you could hear them in the garden munch, munch. Also hedgehogs, which make an amazing noise like a loud snore. Alice was terrified at first. She thought it was ghosts. One morning Ma was chuckling over a letter that came in the mail. It cheered us no end to see her laugh. There hadn't been much of that for a long time. "What is it?" asked Alice. "A letter from a couple of old biddies who want to come and spend a fortnight in September. I suppose they are nervous elderly spinsters. They say they like the sound of the peace and quiet, but want to know if the house is haunted. Well, I can write with a clear conscience and tell them that I've never heard of any such thing." Alice looked at me and I looked at her, but neither of us said anything. Why should we, after all? Lodgers had been rather sparse that summer, and Ma would be telling the truth as far as she knew it. She never gossiped with the locals, so she hadn't heard about the Shrieking Door, and it hadn't shrieked, so that we, who had been told the story by our mates at school, had no particular cause to believe the tale. Our little house was cozy and friendly, smelled of wood smoke and apples when you walked in, accepted squares of sunshine through its tiny windows, and offered no sound apart from the crackle of logs on the fire or sigh of wind in the chimney. Ma had had new wooden floorboards laid in a couple of the rooms, over the bricks for warmth, and these had shrunk as they dried. Just sometimes you'd get the feeling as if somebody had stepped onto the board you stood on and made it bend a little. That was all. As Mr. Hicks says, Alice and I have no imagination. So we said nothing to Ma about squinting Edrica, and Ma wrote and told the two ladies that, to the best of her knowledge, the house was clear of ghost infestation, and in due course the ladies arrived. They were a slight surprise. For a start, they weren't anything as old as we'd imagined. Both in their late 30s, no more, though Miss Baskin's hair was a soft, beautiful white. Miss Findlater was lean and elegant and dark, with hair upswept in a stylish chignon. She was a sociologist. Miss Baskin taught languages, each at a different university. That was the second surprise. We had somehow assumed that they lived and spent their lives together. But no, it seemed they only met every 5 years or so for a joint holiday. Casual friends, then? Yet we did get the feeling that they were very, very devoted to each other. Even from odd glimpses, as they ran down the stairs and out into the forest or came back, grass-stained, holding bunches of berries and scabious at the end of the day, it was possible to see what a lot they meant to each other. Although Miss Baskin's name was Gloria, and Miss Findlater's name Olive, they addressed each other gaily as Bee or My Bee. I had just been reading a book about the ladies of Llangollen, and knew that this was an abbreviation for My Beloved. Another thing that struck us as a little odd was that Mrs. Findlater brought along with her a canary in a cage and a goldfish in a bowl. But, she explained, reasonably enough, there was nobody she could ask to look after them in her block of flats. And she kept them upstairs. They were no trouble. Ma took quite a liking to the ladies, as we soon began to call them, and chatted with them more than was her custom as they passed back and forth. When Mrs. Lindlatter was laid up one day with a cold, she invited Miss Baskin to share our Sunday dinner. The ladies were her kind of people, she said. They were interesting, did things, read things, knew things. One point did puzzle her, and so, being a blunt, forthright character, she came out with it while Miss Baskin was eating roast lamb and gooseberry tart in our kitchen. If you don't ask, you don't learn, is one of Mother's favorite maxims. You and Miss Findlater seem to be such close friends, she said. I don't understand why you see each other so infrequently. The last time was 4 years ago, you said? That seems so odd to me. I mean, these days. Miss Baskin frowned, smiled, tapped her fingers on the blue and white cloth. It must seem perverse, I know, she said. When we are, as you say, so fond of each other. We've known each other all our lives. We were at school together. But, well, this thing gradually grew up. And it leads to such trouble. She gave a doubtful glance in the direction of Alice and me, but Mother said, Oh, the girls are used to anything. They've seen me through their father's death. They are very adult for their age. They really know all there is to know. About things like lesbian was what she plainly meant, but Miss Baskin said, to tell you the truth, when we heard there were 2 teenage girls in the house, we nearly changed our minds. As we looked, I suppose, particularly blank, she went on. Poltergeist manifestations, you know, are almost invariably associated with the presence of pubertal young people, but your 2 seem particularly balanced and sensible. Poltergeist, said Mother. I don't quite understand. Well, you see, Miss Baskin looked a little embarrassed. It sounds almost unbelievably silly, but it isn't. It'd be quite serious, even tragic. Separate from each other, Olive and I are just 2 ordinary people, as commonplace as can be. But when we are together, we seem to have some queer catalytic effect on our surroundings. If there is any kind of supernatural manifestation about, the 2 of us together may call it up. Once, when we were much younger, we went to Spain together and stayed in a government-run hotel that had been a monastery in the Middle Ages. My goodness, the thought of what happened there still makes me shake. And in other hotels, schools, colleges, people's homes, well, as I say, we've practically given up meeting. But we're so fond of each other that it really is a great deprivation for both of us. So once in a while, if we can find some small, quiet, out-of-the-way spot, we chance it. I didn't dare look toward Alice. I knew, because of the close bond between us, what she must be feeling. Guilt, fright, anger, and a kind of depression. Why should Mother's chance of earning a few pounds have to depend on our keeping quiet about squinting Edrica and her door? We might just as easily not have heard the story. In fact, it is the kind of thing that is generally concealed from prospective house buyers. Squinting Edrica lived sometime in the 16th century. She was a wealthy farmer's daughter. She never married because of her bad squint. Crossed eyes were thought unlucky then, a result of having been overlooked by the evil one. So, although otherwise quite handsome, Edrica remained a spinster. And when her father died, despite the fact that she was his eldest daughter, her younger brother inherited the property because the farm hands wouldn't have worked for a woman, let alone a cross-eyed one. Her brother gave her a decent allowance and built her this cottage in the wood. And of course, by and by, she was assumed to be a witch. That was inevitable because of her looks and her solitary life. It was said that she used to go and talk to a huge tree, the Mall Oak, that stood on the boundary between two parishes. People said she lit Satan's fire under it and danced with fiends. So a posse of do-gooders went out with saws and hatchets and cut down the oak. If the truth be known, they probably had a good use for the timber. Edrica had an ally in the village, a man whose child she had cured of the wasting sickness with a tincture of molly or sorcerer's garlic. This man managed to smuggle her a plank from the felled oak and made her a door out of it. And, unlike other witches who have a bird or a cat as her familiar demon, Edrica was supposed to use the door itself, put questions to it, tell it all the news, and in return, the door would warn her if enemies were approaching by letting out a loud shriek. So several times, when the hostile villagers came to her cottage with the aim of putting her in the stocks or ducking her in the horse pond, the door warned her beforehand by shrieking, and she hid far away in the forest until they grew tired of waiting and went home. Sometimes they broke her furniture or threw her pots about, but she lived very simply, with few possessions, and had precious little they could harm. Perhaps her brother the farmer could help replace what was broken. He must have felt a little bit of guilt about her being passed over when he inherited the property. But in the end, the neighbors got the better of Edrica. They arrived when she was tired, after sitting up 2 nights with a woman in labor. They brought moonwort, which has the property of unlocking locks and unshoeing horses and undoing the effects of spells. They also brought holy water, and drenched the door with that so that it could not shriek. Using these means, they were able to break into the house. Edrica was tied up and dragged off to a huge pile of branches in a clearing, and there she was duly burned. And the door, it was said, wailed and cried like a child all the time this was going on, and everybody who had touched the door died within a year. You'd think they'd have burned the door, too, said Alice skeptically, when someone told her the story. Perhaps they didn't like to waste such a fine slab of wood, I suggested. I suspect the truth is that the story grew up years afterwards. They'd have burned the door fast enough if they really believed it belonged to the devil. What awful lives women had then. Are they so much better now, I wondered. Much better, Alice said stoutly. I remembered that conversation when Miss Baskin told us about herself and her friend. They seemed such a quiet, sympathetic, affectionate pair. It was terrible bad luck on them that they had this peculiar power. Probably they would far rather not have it. And I wondered, in a vague way, whether the power had sprung up because they were obligated to live apart. Supposing they had always been together comfortably, it might never have arisen? And I wondered, in a vague way, whether the power had sprung up because they were obliged to live apart. Supposing that they had always been together, comfortably, might it never have arisen? The intensity of longing for someone who isn't with you can be very bad, I knew. Mother, Alice, and I all longed for Father in our different ways. Alice went off into the forest and had long spells of crying, from which she would return silent, subdued, and red-eyed. Mother could sometimes be heard walking to and fro, in her bedroom well into the small hours. I felt, all the time, a dreadful inner ache, like a hunger that nothing could appease. Perhaps Edrica, too, had felt something like this? Perhaps she had loved some person who wouldn't look at her, because of the squint. Perhaps she felt just such a hopeless pain when she passed his house or saw him ride by on a horse. Maybe that power of feeling, hidden away, suppressed, had been somehow transmuted, sublimated, into the power to cure warts, if that was what Edrica did, or summon up poltergeists. Miss Findlatter's cold got better, and the ladies resumed their habit of going out for day-long excursions. Ma often made them up a packed lunch. One thing she would not do was have the canary and the goldfish downstairs while they were out. "It was only a suggestion," Miss Findlater said apologetically. "They do so enjoy human company, and they get so little of it at home, as I'm out all day teaching." But Mother was firm. "I don't like the company of things in cages," she said. "I quite agree with you," remarked Miss Baskin. This was, we gathered, a point on which the ladies were not in perfect accord. From time to time we'd hear Gloria teasing her friend in a tone that lacked its usual friendliness. Was verging on sharp, in fact. "How can you bear to have those two poor prisoners always about? Why don't you set them free?" And Olive would reply, not in her normal gentle tones, but quite snappishly, "Oh, please don't be so silly, Gloria. How can you set a goldfish free, pray? Or a canary? What am I supposed to do? Let it fly off into the forest? A fine time it would have there. I could just imagine what sort of short, nasty life my poor Billy Bird would have in the forest." "Well, you shouldn't encourage the trade by getting them in the first place." "The trade will go on, with or without my support, and I must have some company. I must say, they seemed poor sort of company to me. A twittering, fluttering nervous bird and a mute fish that did nothing but swim around and around. However, it was not my business. On the whole, we liked the ladies very well. We did notice, though, that, as their visit went on, they seemed to bicker and disagree more and more often. Matters came to a head one afternoon, when a heavy shower had driven them in much earlier than usual. They stopped for a cup of tea in our kitchen. Mother was lamenting about the habits of the deer, which had munched up a whole row of young beans. "Wretched things. There's just no way to keep them out. We need some new hair," I suggested. "Hair? What does hair do?" The ladies had never heard the theory about human hair as a deer deterrent, and were eager to try it out. "We'll cut each other's hair. We can both spare a bit. And we often used to do each other's hair when we were younger. We'll see if it has any effect." Giggling like schoolgirls, they borrowed Mother's sharp scissors and a pile of towels, then set to work on each other in the kitchen. But the results were unfortunate. Perhaps they had lost their skill since those young days, or become more particular. They didn't look too bad to me and Alice, but neither of them was a bit pleased with what the other had done. "You didn't have to chop off quite so much," exclaimed Gloria. "I can't pin it up at the back now. It's all wispy." "You've taken off the part that curls. I look like Mad Maggie," wailed Olive, looking at herself in the glass over the sink. "What will my students say?" Mother tried to make peace by giving them slices of a sponge cake she had baked, and Alice did her best to throw oil on troubled waters, by exclaiming over the panful of black and white hair as she swept it up, "It's so beautiful, like magic stuff. I'm sure it will keep the deer off the late peas. There's such a lot, I'll be able to sprinkle it all along the row." Unfortunately, even the beauty of the chopped-off black and white hair had no effect. Next morning there were deer tracks all over the bed, and most of the peas were gone. "And we lost our hair for nothing," growled Miss Baskin. "What you ought to have, Mrs. Kirby, is a trap. Then you could have venison for supper." "A trap?" Miss Findlater's voice was full of horror and disgust. "How can you make such a heartless suggestion? You, the one who calls herself fond of animals. You, who wants me to get rid of my poor Billy Bird. And who would kill the deer, pray, as it lay in the garden with its leg in the trap? Do you expect Mrs. Kirby to go out with a chopper? Or one of the girls to wring its neck?" All right, I was only joking. A fine sort of joke." Very ill-pleased with each other, the friends set off on their usual excursion. While they wrangled, I had been aware of an odd noise, an unfamiliar noise that I could not place. But when they had started Miss Findlater's car and driven off into the forest, I was able to locate the sound. It came from our front door. The day was glum and damp, oppressively close in spite of the fact that a small, fidgety wind was stirring the trees, making the branches creak. But the wind hardly seemed sufficient to fetch such a wail from the door. It was like a suppressed moan from a person in unbearable pain. "Oh, oh," and then, "Oh, oh." "For heaven's sake," said Mother, "the door's never made that sound before. We'd better oil the hinges." It It was a Saturday, no school for Alice and me, so we helped Ma do this, but oil made no difference. At intervals every 20 minutes or so, the door would suddenly let out its grievous, keening note. Around lunchtime, Mother said, "I don't know if it's because of the door or what, but I've suddenly got the most atrocious headache. I'll have to lie down for a while." Of course, we said don't worry, and we'd do the housework and washing that was usually done on Saturdays. But after an hour, Alice went up to Ma with a cup of tea and came back looking pale and anxious. "I think she's really ill. I think we'd better phone the doctor." Of course, it being Saturday, he was out playing golf. When we finally got to him, I did the telephoning because Alice can't stand phones or dealing with people. He sounded really concerned. "You say she keeps on letting out little shrieks and hardly knows you? I think you'd better get her over to a hospital right away. The ambulance is over at Chetwood, where there's been a bad road smash, and I'm here at the club 10 miles off. Every minute may make a difference. Can you drive her?" "Yes," I said. "Then get her in the car and take her straight to Portsmouth Hospital, and I'll meet you there." "All right," I said, my knees knocking together. I can drive, actually, because I've practiced on the tracks in the forest. But I'm too young, at 16, legally to be in charge of a car on the road. And Alice, who passed her test, is so sick with terror at the wheel that no one in their senses would go in a car driven by her. So Alice sat in the back, her arms around Mother, while I drove with adrenaline pricking up and down my arms, a hollow stomach, a stiff back, and a mouth dry with fear. Mercifully, the hospital, a big new one, is on the outskirts of Portsmouth. I'd never have had the courage to go through the town. Dr. Mayer met us as promised, took one look at Mother, and whizzed her into the intensive care unit. He later told us that what she had was something occult meningitis, and that it was a good thing we'd brought her in so fast, for she would be all right now, but she might easily not have been. We had to have tests too, which took some time, and he told us that it would be no use our going to see Mother today, as she was under heavy sedation. We could come back tomorrow. Then, because, I suppose, we both looked wan and shaky and exhausted, he said we'd better not drive ourselves home, and he found a young male nurse going off duty who lived in our general direction and would tie his motorbike to the rack on top of our car and drive us. We were very grateful to this character, his name was Fred, even more so when we got home and, at our approach, the front door let out a wild scream. "Glory hallelujah, what's that?" said Fred, startled out of his wits. "Oh, it's our door. It does that sometimes," mumbled Alice. "Not too often, I hope." As we opened the front door, Miss Findlater came running down the stairs. Her white hair was wildly untidy, her face pale and distraught. "Have you seen Gloria?" she demanded, without apparently noticing that Mother was missing, or that we had arrived, late and worried, in the company of a strange young man. "No, we just got back from taking Mother to the hospital. Haven't you been together?" "No, we had words, and went off separately. But Gloria must have been back because she opened the cage. My billy bird is missing. And the fish, she must have emptied it into the brook. She was threatening to, but I never believed she would really do such a cruel thing." At this gabble, Alice and I looked at each other, aghast. Miss Findlater sounded half demented, and it sounded as if the composed, elegant Miss Baskin must have had some sort of brainstorm too. "Help me look for her," begged Miss Findlater. "Oh, I'll give her such a talking to when I find her. She must have gone out of her mind." "Yes, we'll help," Alice said wearily, for what else could we do? "But you must be gentle with her when you see her. It sounds as if she must be ill, must need a doctor." Fred, who plainly had a very kind nature, said he would stop and help us search for Miss Baskin. We managed to persuade Miss Findlater, who looked desperately tired and shattered, she had gone quite cross-eyed with distress, to stay in the house in case her friend came back. "Keep the fire up in the kitchen stove," Alice recommended, "and make us some hot soup." And then the three of us went off into the forest in different directions, calling and shouting, "Miss Baskin! Miss Baskin! Gloria!" Twilight was falling, and I've never felt so nervous and jumpy in the forest. Every snap of a twig made me gasp and clench my teeth. The branches creaked overhead, and the wind sighed and blubbered. I was the one who eventually found Miss Baskin. She was sitting on a huge tree stump, moaning and rocking back and forth, her head bowed and her arms around her knees. I was really terrified when I first saw her, because it was almost dark by then, and in the half-light she seemed hardly human, more like some shapeless wild beast. It took a really strong effort to go up and touch her hand. Miss Baskin, you must come back to the house. Your friend is very worried about you." Then she looked up at me. In the dusk her face, with its dark, tangled hair about it, was as white as a bowl of junket. I did a very unkind thing, a wicked thing. I let go her creatures. I couldn't stand the sight of them any longer. "Well, she'll have to get over it," I said. "She can buy others, can't she? But you must come back now. She's worried to death about you." Yes, she muttered. "I must come back." And suddenly, without waiting for me, she jumped up and dashed off headlong in the direction of our cottage. I followed as best I could, but I could not keep up her pace. It had been a long, awful day. I was really tired by now. Miss Baskin fled away in front of me, shouting, "Olive, Olive, I'm coming, wait for me," in a childish, whimpering voice. I followed, panting and gulping, catching my feet in holes and under fallen boughs, while my jeans and shirt were snagged and dragged by gorse and brambles. The forest had never seemed more dark and hostile. Yet there was a light ahead. What could it be? No light was ever seen in that part of the wood, except the small, dim gleam from our cottage's tiny windows. But this light was blazing and fierce, buttercup yellow and leaping. When I reached our garden glade, I saw why. The cottage was on fire and burning like a paper bag. Flames, curved and plated, shot 20 feet into the sky. A roar filled the air, and yet through it all I thought I could hear the satisfied shriek of the front door. Its debt paid at last. "Olive," shouted Miss Baskin again. "Olive! Wait for me, Olive!" And without a second's hesitation, she dashed headlong into the flames. The end.